if we look at clarifying roles and responsibilities, part of what we need to know is who is matched best with whom. Who matches best with the person who uses services? Who's the best match when we're looking at people to share lives or share space? And that whole question of match then becomes critical. And so we've developed a chart. If you look at the chart, you'll see several columns. And the first column says what skills are needed. The second says what supports go with those skills. So those two columns are connected. If you were working with somebody who needed to be physically transferred from the bed to a wheelchair, from the wheelchair to a tub, then you're looking at a skill that somebody needs. Somebody needs to know how to do that transfer so that the person's not hurt and so they're not hurt. But the third column says personality characteristics. And this is what really determines the quality of the match. It's how well you match with that individual. And if you ask people who've done a lot of direct support, have you worked with people that you loved? Have you worked with people that you just found remarkably charming, or people that you just really enjoyed spending time with? You will hear absolutely. And if you ask those same people, have you worked with people who rubbed your fur the wrong way? They will say, oh yes, those folks as well. And what determines whether or not that match works is personality. It's those characteristics, and sometimes it can be quite dramatic and sometimes it's more subtle. There's a fellow that I learned about, a fellow I came to know, a person who became a friend, a fellow named John who lives in California. And John has a condition called Prader-Willi syndrome. And people with that condition have a break on chromosome 15. And because of that break, the part of their brains that says they're full doesn't develop. So they never feel full. And because of that and some other characteristics that go with the condition, they can go from being fine to dead from congestive heart failure in 6 months. So helping them with food becomes quite a critical issue. And the most common way that people have of dealing with that is by grouping, putting people together who have that characteristic. And John hates that. John wants to live on his own. And people said, well, you can't. But he has been living on his own successfully for a decade. And part of the reason why is a good match between John and the people who provide the support. And a piece of that, just one piece, but a very critical piece, is it's people who need to be on time. If you ask people in general who has an on-time compulsion, you will find that the people who say, I must be on time, actually tend to be early. And if they're working with John, and they have that on-time compulsion, and they're driving to John's house, and John has staff who come to his house 4 times a day, put out food, and leave. And the people have a schedule who come to the house, the staff. And if they're due at 8 in the morning, and you're the person driving to John's house and you discover that you're running a bit late and you have that on-time compulsion, you will get anxious and you'll call John. And John will then be just fine. John will actually talk you through, be with you on the phone. And John will greet you at the door at 10 minutes after 8 or whatever time you arrive with a glass of water, saying, here, drink this, it'll help you feel better. But if you don't have that on-time compulsion, if you're one of those folks who sees appointments as being not fixed, but something that's approximate, then you would start out saying, well, of course I'll be on time, but then 6 months later, when traffic is bad, you might be saying to yourself, oh, it's not so bad, I'll just be a little late, or I'll hardly be late, or maybe I won't be late. And then at 5 minutes after 8, you'll arrive, and John thinks that if you aren't there on the stroke of 8, you're never coming. And John's response is to feel anxious and then eat. And even though John's cabinets are secured, they're locked, he will take a big screwdriver and pop the lock. So being on time for John is critical, an absolute critical piece. And don't forget the last column, shared common interests, because those are the kinds of things that you talk about. So if you're into football and the person you're working with is into football, you can have endless conversations about football. If you're into the movies and the person's into the same kind of movies, then you can have conversations about that. But shared common interests then help the day go by, help people enjoy the time they have together. And matching is the single most critical thing we can do for quality of life for the folks who use services. It is the single most powerful thing for us to do. Because where there's a good match, then your caring about the person will cause you to do whatever it takes to help that person have the life that makes the most sense for them. And what we'll see when we have good matches is not only is there an improved quality of life, but there's a decrease in things that people who run services want to avoid. Incidents, challenging behaviors, and turnover of staff.